Our scripture reading for this morning comes from John 21, and we'll be reading verses 15 through 25. Hear now the word of the Lord. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who testifies these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I would suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. This is the word of the Lord. So last week we began looking at this final chapter of John. As we did, we're able to look at the miraculous catch of fish and how Jesus used 153 fish to remind each of the disciples of the role to which he had called each of them. The disciples were to be fishers, not of fish, but of men. They were to preach the gospel and to tell others how their Lord Jesus Christ had died to save them from their sins, and that he had been risen back to life so that we too could experience fellowship and communion with him. In doing so, these disciples would cast a new kind of net into the world, and the Lord himself would fill it with new believers who were responding to the gospel message that they would preach. And as our Lord reminded them of this calling to be fishers of men, he fed them and he provided the nourishment they needed to carry out this task of preaching the gospel that he was calling them to. As the disciples are finishing this breakfast meal that Jesus had provided, Jesus turns his attention specifically to Peter. Peter was one of Jesus' first disciples. Jesus had called him out of the fishing boat of the Sea of Galilee after the first miraculous catch. Peter was the older brother to Andrew, who was another of Jesus' disciples. And he was the only one that we know of that had a life while he was a disciple. In Mark 1, verse 30, we read that Jesus goes to Peter's house to heal his mother-in-law who had been in bed with a fever. Now, along with Jesus, Peter's the only one that was required to pay the temple tax. In Matthew 17, when called upon to pay this tax, Jesus instructs Peter to go out and to catch a fish. And in the mouth of this fish, he would find a 4 drachma coin that was enough to pay the temple tax for Jesus and for Peter. And as the oldest of Jesus' disciples, possibly even older than Jesus, he would have been a natural leader from among the disciples after Jesus' resurrection, as Jesus was no longer regularly with them. Along with James and John, Peter was part of Jesus' inner circle. These three went up the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. They witnessed him appear along with Moses and Elijah in his heavenly form. And he and John were the ones that were sent ahead to prepare the Passover meal the day before Jesus was crucified. And that night, as they finished the meal and as they went out to the Garden of Gethsemane, it was Peter along with James and John that were the three that Jesus invited to go farther into the garden to pray with, or to stay awake and to keep watch as he prayed. And then as Judas leads this army of men into the garden to arrest Jesus, it's Peter that pulls out his sword and strikes Malchus on the side of the head, cutting off his ear. And as things begin to settle and as they lead Jesus away, it's Peter who tries to follow and stay as close behind Jesus as he can without being caught. He follows all the way to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. And as Jesus is being interrogated in one of the inner rooms, Peter stands out in the courtyard. He warms himself beside a coal fire. The other disciples have all fled, but Peter remains as close to Jesus as he dares. This is, of course, where everything takes a dramatic turn for the worse for Peter. A servant girl standing there by the fire notices that he's a Galilean, and so she accuses him of being a friend of Jesus. Peter denies it, and he tries to walk away, but she follows him and she points out to the others that are standing there that he is the Galilean and that he must have been with Jesus. And he denies it again. And when those who are standing there along with Peter and along with the servant girl begin to listen and begin to recognize that yes, Peter may have been along with Jesus, Peter curses and he again claims to not even know who Jesus was. And that's when the rooster crows. And Peter's immediately reminded of Jesus' words the night before. Before the rooster crows twice, he will deny me 3 times. Peter had always been quick to act, quick to respond. He's a man of action and he's not known for thinking before he speaks. He's the one that speaks on behalf of the other disciples in professing Jesus as their Lord and Savior, the one true Son of God, when it's just them gathered together. But then on the Mount of Transfiguration, he's also the one that suggested to build 3 shelters. One for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for Jesus. As if the 3 of them were going to be there on that mountain to stay. At times, Peter's quite bold. And his impulsiveness has shown the faith that he has. But as he is arrested, it's what gets him into the most trouble. The man who had once claimed, even if all fall away, I will not, is now the one of Jesus' disciples who has publicly denied knowing him. And this is the Peter that we find on the boat with the disciples that early morning as Jesus appears on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. This is a man who has not only been humbled, but he has been humiliated. Peter has seen the empty tomb. He was with the other disciples as Jesus appeared to them, so he knows that his Lord is alive. But he struggles to see how he fits into God's plan and how Jesus plans to use him after he has fallen so far. It was Jesus who gave him this name, Peter in Greek, or Cephas in Aramaic. And as he did, Jesus spoke these words about Peter, "On this rock I will build my church." But if Peter's a rock, he feels as if he has been cast upon another, much harder rock, and that he has been shattered into tiny pieces of stone. Not much of a foundation for a church. And now Peter sits in the boat. And he seems to not even be able to do that anymore. He's no longer effective even as a fisherman. He's been out all night and he has nothing to show for it. And that voice that calls to them from the shores of the sea as the sun comes up almost seems to taunt him. Haven't you any fish yet? You've been out all night. Have you tried the other side of the boat? There might be fish there. Reluctantly, Peter and the others cast their nets to the right side of the boat. And immediately they're filled with fish, and so much that they can't even pull these nets back into the boat. And it's not Peter, but it's John that recognizes this miracle. He has seen it once before when Jesus told Peter to cast his nets into the shores as he first called these first disciples. And as John recognizes the miracle, he turns to Peter and he says, "It is the Lord." And in this moment, we catch a glimpse of this old, impulsive Peter, the one who claims that he'll stop at nothing to follow his Lord. The one who had once climbed out of a boat to walk on water to get to where Jesus was. He now stands up in the boat. He wraps his cloak around him and he ties it up in his belt and he jumps in and he swims straight for Jesus. And in this moment, the fish don't matter, the nets don't matter, neither do the boats or even the other disciples. The ones who are struggling to pull the nets back into the boats. The only thing that matters to Peter in that moment was that Jesus was standing on the seashore, and he wanted to be there with him. Now, John doesn't record any conversation that may have happened between Peter and Jesus before the rest of the disciples arrived with these nets full of fish. And so if they did exchange words, those were words that were meant for Jesus and for Peter alone. But after he feeds them, Jesus turns his attention toward Peter. "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, John's very careful about the details he includes in the telling of this story. The disciples are eating breakfast. They're sitting around a charcoal fire, very much like the one that Peter stood beside when he first denied Jesus. And Jesus asks Peter 3 times, just like Peter had denied Jesus, knowing Jesus 3 times. And in these moments, we begin to see that Jesus is reversing Peter's denial, and he's undoing the curse that Peter had called upon himself when he denied Jesus that 3rd time. Even in Jesus' question, "Do you love me more than these?" Peter had said, "If all of these fall away, I will follow." And he was comparing himself to the other disciples. And now Jesus was asking him if he was still willing to compare himself to the other disciples. This time he won't. He has learned his lesson. He says, "You know I love you." Now, the answer that Peter gives is actually slightly different than the question that Jesus asks. You see, in Greek there are multiple words for the word love, and we only have one in the English language. And so the words that are used, Peter uses one and Jesus uses another. The word Jesus uses is agape. And to best understand what agape means, that it's translated somewhat as the choosing to love, or the loving with your complete self. And the word that Peter uses is philo. And philo more describes the feeling of love than the choice to love someone. And so Jesus' question of Peter might be translated something like this. "Peter, do you choose to love me with your entire being and with all of who you are?" And Peter's response might sound something like this. "Lord, you know all things. You know that I feel love for you." Now, can you hear the difference? How it sounds different, how the one is much more of a commitment and the other is a simple response. And in the second time, they use these same 2 words. The Lord asks, Peter, do you choose to love me with your whole self? And Peter responds, saying, Lord, you know I feel love for you. And finally, when Jesus asks the third time, he chooses to use the words that Peter used. He chooses to say, Peter, do you feel love for me? He's meeting Peter where he is at. And while Peter is hurt, he still responds and he says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I feel love for you. And in this conversation, we see that Peter is not only not willing to compare himself or to put himself above the other disciples, but he's not even able to use the same words as Jesus in describing his love for him. There may have been a time in his life where he would boldly proclaim his commitment to love Jesus with his everything. But now, as they sit around this charcoal fire, the only thing that Peter can do is to commit to the feeling of love that he is experiencing in those moments. This is the only thing that he can be certain of, is what he's feeling in those moments. But for Jesus, this is all that he needs. This is the response that he needs from Peter. And each time Peter expresses his love for Jesus, Jesus responds with a separate but similar command. Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, and feed my sheep. Now these responses each time are slightly different. And John doesn't indicate why he records them differently and why Jesus spoke them differently. But what he does communicate and what Jesus wants Peter to understand is that Jesus still has a plan for Peter and that his plan has not changed. Not only is Peter being called to be a fisher of men along with the other disciples, but Jesus is also calling Peter to stand in for Jesus and to care for the flock. Jesus has called himself the Good Shepherd, and now he is saying to Peter, I need you to care for my sheep. Jesus has just handed Peter the keys to the church, and he has commissioned him as its leader. Now, a Roman Catholic understanding of this text and of other texts would suggest that there can only be one Peter, and that there can only be one person who holds the keys to the church and the keys to the kingdom of heaven at any one time. And so in the Catholic Church, there's been a long line of Peter's successors who have led the church from Rome, and they've given these individuals the title of Pope. In our church, a more reformed understanding of this text is not to say that there can only be one Peter and that there can only be one who will lead the church, but rather that someone like Peter, who had only a few weeks before just denied knowing Jesus, and who can now only profess a small feeling of love for Jesus, can be used by God to accomplish his purposes. Peter has value, not because of what he has done, but because of what Jesus has done for him, and because of what Jesus has called him to do. A quick study through the New Testament reveals that this early church had many leaders. There was Peter, who was the first to stand up at Pentecost and to proclaim the gospel for thousands to hear. But there's also James, the brother of Jesus, who later became the head of the church in Jerusalem. There's John, who wrote this book, the one who reclined with Jesus at the table, who was also a leader in the church. And there was Paul, there's Apollos, there's Barnabas, there's Silas, there's Timothy, and there are so many others. All of these individuals shared the leadership of the church in that day. And today, it's no different. Our church is filled with leaders who have varying degrees of responsibility as they work in different roles within the church. You've been asked to pray for those who are allowing their names to stand for the positions of elder and deacon. And these people are in need of your prayer, but also in need of prayer of the other leaders, those who lead worship, those who lead the cadet program, the GEM program, the Sunday school, young people's catechism, coffee break, VBS fellowship, and outreach, and so many other ministries within this church. And that is only one kind of leadership. There are also those who operate behind the scenes, those who offer words of encouragement and who sit with others in their time of need. People who could never get up in front of the church or a classroom or any other crowd, but who find other ways to respond to this call that Jesus has placed on each of our lives. Brothers and sisters, we are all leaders in this church. And so Jesus' words to Peter to feed and to care for this church are words that are expressed to each one of us as well. And like Peter, we could look back at our lives and see how far we have fallen short of the will of God. Or we can choose to hear Jesus' words to Peter and hear them as our own. And to recognize that the love that the Lord has for us. And to recognize that Jesus continues to entrust us with the keys of his church and with the responsibility to care for each other and to preach the gospel to those who do not yet know him. Like Peter, and like each of the disciples, we are called to be fishers of men. And so too, we are also called to be shepherds, caring for the flock, watching over one another, protecting one another, and caring for each other. And we can look at Peter, we can follow the example that Peter led, because if God can use a man who is as broken as Peter once was, then he can use each one of us as well. Thanks be to God. Amen. Let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, this morning we have heard how some of your early servants, including Peter, have fallen so short of your will. And yet, as you have healed and restored them, as you have called them, and given them a renewed sense of your calling in their lives, you have brought them into new roles of leadership and new roles of influence, Lord, to carry out your will, to preach your word, and to care for your people. Lord, this morning I pray that we may hear that call as a call that you have given to each one of us. We play different roles in your church, Lord, and we interact with people around us in the surrounding community in different ways, Lord. But each of us is called to be your light, to be fishers of men, and to care for the flock. I pray, Lord, that you may help each one of us to recognize the role that we have and to carry it out in the power of your Holy Spirit. In your name we pray.